Yeah, I think I'll get going so we can make the most of the hour. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Hello. I'm John Taylor. I'm the head of capacity building at Community Energy England. And yeah, thank you for joining our lunchtime learning session about the Energy Redress and the Just Transition Fund. Um, I know it's coming up very fast, so a lot of you are keen to understand how you can best access it. And yeah, we've got Graham Ayling with us today to give you a presentation and answer some of your questions. So just a bit of housekeeping to kick things off. The call will be recorded, so everyone's okay with that. You can, yeah. We'll try and share the recording onto our YouTube channel and Lumio pages later on. Yeah, feel free to use the chat function as well. Say hello, and we've also got a Q&A feature. So please put your questions in there throughout the session. Okay. So before we get started, I'll just show you this slide, giving you an idea of the structure of today's session. I'll give a quick introduction to Community Energy England, and then I'll hand over to Graham Ayling from the Energy Saving Trust, who will do a quick overview of the funding, what the Energy Redress Fund is, what the different funds are within it, and how organisations can apply. We'll also talk through some success stories and examples of projects funded and tips for making a successful application. Following that, we'll get on with the Q&A. So if you have questions, please submit them via the Q&A function within Zoom. That's different to the chat. So you can use the chat for general discussion, but any questions in the Q&A bit, and please review and upvote questions within that as well. So we'll probably use the most ranked questions to kind of guide what we do in the Q&A section. Okay, so in terms of introducing Community Energy England, yeah, Community Energy England, we're the membership body for the community energy sector, founded in 2014 by practitioners to act as the voice of the sector, connect up community activity across the country, and help put people at the heart of the energy system. Our membership has grown to over 320 members now, the vast majority being community energy organisations, plus supportive stakeholder groups, corporates and local authorities, who work alongside us in localising energy. All our work is intended to help clear obstacles, create connections between practitioners and stakeholders, and facilitate the work of community energy organisations, thereby benefiting the sector as a whole. We work to make politicians, national and local government officials, and electricity network operators aware of the community energy benefits the sector needs, and the opportunities holding us back, as well as the policy obstacles. So the policy and advocacy work is a very big part of what we're doing. Yeah, a lot going on behind the scenes at the moment with GB Energy and DESNZ, but hopefully some good announcements coming out soon. So we do all this to ensure that community energy organisations are able to create new projects and play an active and important role in the energy transition. Yeah, we know there's so much potential out there still. If you want to find out about our current policy work and activities, so take a look at our policy and advocacy section on the website. There'll be links to current consultations, active campaigns and policy responses, as well as guidance and resources for how you can play your part. Yesterday, quite a few members from the sector spoke at the Energy Security Net Zero Select Committee. So there's an online recording of that. So great opportunity to make our case direct to MPs. Right, I think it's time. I'll hand over now to Graham to go through the content, and welcome. Cheers.
Thanks, John. Very much appreciated. And thanks everyone for taking the time to join us. So I'm going to do a presentation that mainly focuses on the Just Transition, which is our Just Transition Fund, which is our newest fund. Because I've talked quite a lot about the other funds in the past, but I'm happy to answer questions on any of the funds, and I will make a few comments that kind of relate to everything. One thing to say is those of you that have been keeping an eye on Energy Redress will realise we've got a deadline coming up on the 20th of March, which is deadline for our next fund. So if you're absolutely brand new to Redress and you haven't registered with the scheme yet, might be worth thinking about the next round after that, because we ask everyone to register with the fund first, and then we do kind of basic due diligence. So that it's not like fill in the registration form and press submit and you're in. We have to do some due diligence, and there's sometimes questions around that. So you might struggle to be able to get set up and get a strong bid in for the 20th, unless you're absolutely confident that you're all there and you register straight away after this call. We do actually have a kind of cut-off date of 10 days, 10 working days before the deadline. So we are past that cut-off date. But yeah, I would recommend doing longer. But the key thing that I was going to mention alongside that is we run our funding rounds quarterly, so every 3 months. And this year we will be announcing dates for those up front. So you've only got kind of 3 months before the next opportunity, 3 months tops, potentially a little bit shorter, before the next opportunity to bid in. So, by all means, register as soon as you're ready, and you can actually start drafting up an application ahead of when a round opens, and then just submit it when the round opens. In the past, we've not generally announced the dates of the funds too far ahead because we don't actually know how much money is in the budget at the start of the year. The money kind of comes in from these voluntary payments from energy companies as and when. But for this year, we know we've got a good amount of money in the pot. We're not expecting the payments to dry up. So we're pretty confident we're going to be able to run 4 quarterly rounds with a good size budget for each of them. So that's no great revelation. We're happy to share that with people. The amounts of each round will only be announced just beforehand, just because we like to try and, the amount in the fund varies depending on what new payments have come in. And for anyone who's absolutely brand new to Energy Redress, what Energy Redress does is distributes voluntary payments from energy companies that arise as a result of Ofgem investigations. So basically, if Ofgem identifies that an organisation has broken rules in some way, shape, or form, they can be fined. That goes back to Treasury. They can pay direct compensation payments. There's usually a kind of action plan to fix whatever the problem was. And then the last kind of measure that there is voluntary redress payments. So basically, an energy company can say, look, we recognise something's gone wrong here. We want to give some money to good causes. We'll do it through the redress fund. And that's the funding that we then manage. So that's what Energy Redress is about. Can we have the next slide, please? So generally, the number one priority for Energy Redress is energy consumers in vulnerable situations, and 70% of the funding goes to that. And at the minute, it has to be charities, registered charities, that apply to those funds related to that. But we also have up to 15% of the budget, so 30% in total across two main priorities, which are innovation that benefits energy consumers and carbon emissions reduction. So we previously had those two separate funds, which were opened up to community energy sector. Those were running for a while. And we then decided to set up this new fund called the Just Transition Fund, which is basically a subset of it's under the carbon emissions reduction priority. So it has a bit of the budget from the carbon emissions reduction fund. And essentially we were just thinking, okay, well, let's do a fund that is very targeted. And the aim of this fund is to support the development of community-owned renewable energy projects that benefit vulnerable energy consumers. And the reason that we did this, partly we know the transition is racing ahead. We want to try and maximize the social benefit of that and give community energy an opportunity to, own as much of that, of the future energy sector as possible. But also we're very conscious, as John mentioned earlier, the local power plan is coming. And this felt like an opportunity to make some resources available to help the community energy sector be ready for when, whatever comes forward from local power plan comes forward and actually try and make sure that there's a really strong pipeline there of projects that will have really good kind of social impact. So what we mean by projects that benefit vulnerable energy consumers, this is for funding core community-owned renewable energy, but the kinds of things that we have envisaged are a community renewables project that then puts some of its surplus into a community fund that supports people in fuel poverty or advises, funds a service that advises people in fuel poverty. It could be community energy that is targeted at disadvantaged communities and has governance in place that involves people from within those communities. Or it could be projects that are directly addressing fuel poverty, so directly supplying people who are in that kind of situation. So we've left it reasonably open, but we just wanted to kind of bring together the different priorities of energy redress and also just try and create some really visible examples, case studies of what a just transition can look like. Next slide, please. So the kinds of activity that can fund. At the minute, this fund is revenue specific, not capital. And part of the reason for that is that was the kind of feedback that we had from people that's the key need at the minute is revenue funding to help people actually develop projects. So it can fund staff posts that might be working on project development. It can fund studies that you need to progress a project, detailed feasibility studies, environmental studies, design work, those kinds of things. Could fund community engagement, getting people involved and promoting a kind of share issue or similar, and other associated costs, travel, equipment to use, and all of that kind of thing. Next slide, please. So just a couple of quick notes about applying for it. So I'll highlight this later on, but as I mentioned, this is a kind of sub-fund, if you like, of the Carbon Emissions Reduction Fund. So there is guidance on the Energy Redress website, which again I've got in the presentation, which will be shared afterwards. So you can get guidance there for the Carbon Emissions Reduction Fund. So definitely look at that guidance. But then there's also a bit of specific supplementary guidance for the Just Transition Fund. So a couple of bits of guidance that we give people. Be really clear about what you're aiming to achieve. So let us know if you're developing a community renewables project, what technology you're using, what's the size of the system, how you plan to develop it, if you have any impact figures in terms of what carbon emissions you expect to save over the lifetime or amount of generation over the lifetime. All of that sort of stuff is really useful. We realize sometimes you'll be at a very early stage, but I guess anything that you can give us kind of indicative is really helpful, because across all of the funds for energy redress, cost effectiveness is one of the kind of really important criteria for the fund, as you might expect. But we always do that on the basis of what's the potential impact for the amount of money. So it's not just about trying to do everything on the cheap. It's actually how much impact. The thing that we're really interested in is how can we get the maximum impact from every pound of redress money. So it really helps assessors to understand if you're able to say, even if it's at an early stage and you want to say, we're going to do a ground mounted PV system and we're aiming in the region of, 1 to 5 megawatts or something like that, that sort of information is fine. And it's not something that you'll then be rigidly held to, but it helps people to understand, okay, how big is this thing? How much impact might it have? And therefore kind of, being able to cross-reference with how much it costs and see, okay, that's a reasonable kind of development cost for a project of that scale. So yeah, include any of that impact information that you have. Also include long-term plans. So if it's not a massive installation that you're putting in, but you're actually testing it out in a certain application and you think there's loads and this could be rolled out across a huge area, definitely tell us all of that stuff, because that's useful to understand the impact of the project. So we will take that wider impact into account, but obviously the more information you can provide about, what's the scale of the opportunity, how easy might it be to roll out, and all of that kind of stuff is always really useful. And again, that applies across all of the funds. Be clear about who will benefit. So we do need to be quite careful to keep redress funds in the public, working for the public good, basically. And so there can be some situations where it could be argued that particular organizations are benefiting. We need to be a little bit careful that no one could ever say redress money is being used to sort of give someone an unfair advantage. And we avoid that a bit by working with not-for-profit organizations, obviously, but there can still be some situations where if there's a close commercial relationship, is this actually about opening up a new market for lots of things to happen, or is it actually there a risk that the main benefit will be to one particular company? So that's the sort of stuff that we have to look at. And who will own stuff and who's getting the benefit of it. So again, if it's vulnerable energy consumers, that's very clearly for the public good. If there are businesses that might get some of the benefit, is there a reason why they should get that benefit for free, or are they making some kind of contribution? All of those kinds of things, just to kind of understand what the case for using redress money is. Yeah, and I've mentioned energy consumers in vulnerable situations. So then the last thing is to be clear about what stage you're at and what stage you plan to get to. Can we have the next slide, please? I think it's on the next slide. Yeah, so basically, because this is development funding, we understand that there's not necessarily going to be an installation immediately at the end of the project. We can only fund for up to 2 years. So we understand that sometimes these things take longer than 2 years to get to the end and get installed. But what we want to understand is what's the impact of the redress money. So how is the redress money going to get you from you're at outline feasibility stage and you want to work it up to the stage where you can understand, okay, this is potentially a viable project, there's an outline business plan, or are you actually a long way down the line and you've already got your planning permission, but your planning permission has kind of is asking you to do extra stuff that you need help with. So I guess help us to understand what stage you're getting from and to. And I'm not going to go through this very wordy slide, and apologies for how wordy it is. But this is from scheme guidance, so you can just go and see this in the supplementary guidance for the Just Transition Fund. But this was kind of a rough structure of how you develop a community renewables project that we've put in there, so that you can use that language if you want to. Honestly, as long as the language is really clear about what stage you're at and where you're going to get to, we don't mind too much, but we thought it might be helpful to give people a framework. It's helpful if you use this, because then it means that we're kind of on the same wavelength and we understand where you're aiming to get to and from. Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. And so then alongside what you aim to achieve, what will you actually do to achieve that? So what actions will you take to deliver the aims that you've outlined? I guess be specific about any roles that you'll fund. What tasks are they going to carry out? How is that going to help progress the project? What studies or consultancy do you need? How's that going to help to progress the project? And definitely what risks there are to the project. I think probably a top tip across the board for all redress funds is that I think it's difficult to say what is the most common thing that results in applications being unsuccessful, but as a very general thing, I think a lot of it is the practicalities. So I think maybe as a funder, perhaps more than some other funders, we're quite focused on the practicalities because we really want to fund projects that are going to have the best chance of achieving impact. And so we do look quite hard at that stuff and try and understand, okay, how is this actually going to work? Is it, how well thought through is it, and all of that kind of stuff. And that's not to say if you haven't been funded that we don't think it's well thought through, but I guess sometimes that information doesn't get into the application quite as much, because I know not all funders want that. Some people are much more focused on the concept. But I think for us, we do look quite hard at all of those practicalities because we want the projects to be successful once they get funded. So definitely, whatever fund you're applying for, do kind of look really hard at that, and I guess make sure that what you're doing really clearly links back to the aims as well. That's also really helpful because if there's a very clear way that the project has been tailored to deliver what it's trying to deliver, that's always really helpful. Sorry, that sounds really obvious, but like if you're targeting a particular sector, group, situation, housing type, all of that stuff, sometimes the sort of specifics of how you're going to adapt the project for that specific situation doesn't always make it into the application. So definitely make sure that you're doing that as clearly as you can. Okay, next slide, please. So yeah, cost effectiveness. I mentioned this earlier, and it is a really important part of the funding. And it is very much, as I said, we look at the impact versus the cost of the project. So for Just Transition Fund, what is the size of the project that you're trying to develop? What benefits will come from that? Are there lots of wider benefits? Is it replicable? What's your plan at this stage to do with the community fund? So that can be really important. We've asked a lot of sort of follow-up questions with some of the projects from the first round on that, to just be really clear that it is, that there is a kind of tangible benefit to energy consumers in vulnerable situations. Will any other projects follow? Can you see it being rolled out more widely? Is it replicable? All of those kinds of things. I think that impact stuff is quite important. I think a very basic thing here is we understand when you're planning out what, and I'm someone who's been on the other side of the fence and done funding applications and done lots of unsuccessful and some successful applications as well. And I think it's, I guess, when you're very focused on how much money you need to do the work, what we wanted to try and avoid is a situation where we've got a bid here that's actually for quite a small installation, and does the prep work end up costing as much as just paying for the installation? That's the kind of situation that we're trying to avoid. To be fair to everybody that supplied, the vast majority of the applications that we've got were really clear on that. The amount, I guess, and probably the rule of thumb here is just cross-reference. Okay, how much money are we actually asking for here versus what would be the cost of the installation itself? And obviously, we always want to see that the development costs are kind of proportionate to the scale of the project. And that's where it's also really useful to capture that potential for replication, because sometimes you might be doing something that is a bit expensive because it's the first time that you're doing this, but if you can make a really clear case that actually this could be done in loads of other places, then that can help show, okay, there is going to be more impact in the longer term for this. On the cost, it isn't just the cost. So I know we'll probably talk more about feedback later, but I think the cost, obviously it does look at what's the impact for the amount of money that it's costing, but sometimes there might be a project where actually the costs are okay, but it's breaking some of the rules around the budgeting and the finance, and so that would then impact the score. So if it's something that's kind of clearly outside of what we're able to fund, then it could fail on cost effectiveness, even if it's reasonably cost effective, because it's just we can't fund things that way. So definitely do have a look at the guidance around costs, because we do occasionally get applications where it's a good application, something that we'd love to fund, but it's just actually kind of breaking a key rule there. So some of the things that you might want to keep an eye on there are staff costs. So for applicants to the scheme and their partners, those costs have to be charged at basically staff cost. So reflecting what the gross salary of people is, and then you can add up to 25% overhead around that, and then charge other kind of very project specific costs. If there's anyone that needs to charge a commercial day rate, because we understand obviously if you're working with environmental consultants or installers or whoever, those people are not going to charge at their salary rate. They're going to charge you a commercial day rate. But in those cases, we ask that that they're procured, or at least you're following your procurement policy to do that with the and the idea behind that is it kind of helps drive cost effectiveness, make sure that everything is being there's a fair price being paid for things. So if there is a commercial day rate there, the grantee can't charge a commercial day rate, but if you have to bring in a commercial provider, just make sure that you're being clear that they've either been procured already or they are being procured, and it follows your kind of solid procurement policy. And I guess also then, and this is probably could be quite relevant for just transition fund projects, try and make sure it's clear how all the different parts of the budget contribute to the impact of the project. So that just makes it much easier for somebody that's assessing to go, yes, I can see why all these things are necessary. So if you need to put a bit more in the narrative or add a little bit more description in the budget, definitely do that. It just makes it much easier for people to see why all those things are needed. Especially if you've got quite high marketing costs, that kind of stuff, a little bit more detail around that to show that it's that it's absolutely necessary, and it's what's the benefit that it's bringing. All of that kind of stuff is really helpful. Yeah, and I've talked already about making sure that the cost is reasonable compared to the scale and impact of the project. Next slide, please. So that's kind of the end of most of my presentation. As I said before, there's two bits of guidance that are relevant. Definitely look at the guidance for applicants to the Innovation and Carbon Emissions Reduction Fund. That's where you will find most of the scheme rules and all of that kind of stuff. It also there's a bit of information at the start, and it's then laid out in the same way as the application form. And don't worry, we know that we're not expecting anyone to kind of read and memorize the guidance. So we tried to structure it that way so you can just have it open in a separate window on the screen or as a printout or whatever. You can have it next to you when you're writing the application, and then you can just cross-reference and check across for each sort of area of the application form. Am I covering the things that I need to cover? Is there anything in here that I need to be taken account of in terms of the rules and that kind of stuff? So we've tried to make it easy to use as a reference document that way, rather than expecting everyone to read it cover to cover and memorize it. So yeah, and then the other piece of guidance is the Just Transition Fund supplementary guidance. So that talks about some of the things that I'm talking about today, but that gives you more specific guidance on this particular fund. And there's a hyperlink there to the application pack on the website, and that's where you'll find all of that guidance. And the other thing that I've also put in there is the we've done a bunch of these webinars before for about all different aspects of the scheme, and so you can access a lot of those are recorded, and you can access those on the website as well. So there's a much longer session about the Just Transition Fund on there, but there's also other kind of top tips for doing an application, or talking about how assessors look at applications, that kind of thing. So have a look at those by all means. Next slide, please. Yeah, so that's just content details. So that was all I was going to say for now. Happy to answer questions or hand back to John.
Yeah, thanks, Graham. So yeah, we've had quite a few questions coming in during that. So I've tried to filter them by the most upvoted. So I'll start in that order. So I'll just pitch them out to you, Graham, and then I guess
Sure.
take them one by one. So the first one had in from Karen Aiden. So having applied several times to the redress funding and been unsuccessful, can we get some more details of what is expected in this application scoring, as we're struggling to know how to make improvements that then meet the scoring matrix? So is that included in guidance about?
Yeah. So we at the minute we do feedback for applications, as some of you will know. We just give people a kind of indicative, this is the areas where you scored higher or lower, so these are the areas to focus on when you're doing a reapplication. And the reason, or a big part of the reason we do things that way, is we get a lot of applications, and we kind of have to manage the workload a bit. We are currently looking at how we do feedback generally, and that's part of the reason that we're doing more of this kind of thing, so that we can talk about that more and give out some key messages. But we're also thinking longer term about how we do the feedback. Do also, so I think in the feedback documents that we give, you should be able to go through to the guidance. So often that if you have a look at the relevant section of the guidance for those different sections, that will give you a bit more of a steer as well. And I guess also the webinars, we do talk there quite a lot about what issues there can be. But yeah, we've heard people's questions about the feedback, and we're just looking at the minute at how we can be as helpful as we can on that, I guess.
Great. Next question, sent from Cara Whelan this time. What is considered value for money? Can you clarify that? So is it like £1 spent per hundreds of people advised, or is there a kind of benchmark you use?
Yeah, this is a difficult one because we get quite a wide variety of different projects in. Um, it can be quite difficult to just give a simple benchmark because they're often doing quite different things. If you are doing an advice related project, and I realized that at the minute community energy organizations can't bid into the main fund, which is where a lot of the advice happens because it's fuel poverty focused advice. But if you were doing some kind of, trying to support able to pay retrofit, which is something that we have funded sometimes, then I think if you if you look in the scheme guidance, and it might be that you'd need to look in the I can't remember if it's in the innovation. There's two separate guidance documents which have a lot of crossover, but there's a separate one for innovation and carbon emissions, and then there's a separate one for the main fund. So if you can't find it in the carbon emissions one, look in the main fund one. But in there, there's a bit of a guide for roughly what we think is reasonable price per intervention. And so those give you a little bit of a guide, but we also appreciate that they're not absolutely hard because we understand that, for example, some projects might be working with a community where English is a second language, or people with different kind of health conditions and living with different disabilities, where just going and doing a home visit with someone and supporting them is actually much higher cost. And so we do take that sort of stuff into account. And so you'll see in the application form, there's a section on scope of advice where you can talk about all of that sort of stuff. But I mean, in a way, I would probably go back to what I was saying earlier about there is a really good rule of thumb that if you're encouraging action, whether that is working towards a renewables installation, or whether it's going out and advising people and trying to encourage them to save energy, we definitely want to avoid a situation where the advice is costing as much as just doing the thing, if you see what I mean. So, like if you're getting into hundreds of pounds per household to do advice, we might start to think, well, actually, it'd be cheaper to just go and do the measures. And so I guess that's the sort of thinking that we want people to apply is, how, and we do understand that sometimes, if you're trying to encourage people to go net zero and put in a heat pump and a battery and a PV system and all of that kind of thing, that might be more expensive than encouraging someone to put their loft insulation in, because you're doing a lot more technical work, but the prize is bigger potentially in terms of savings. So it's those sort of things that we look at. But we do quite regularly apply, if it's something that is working in the domestic sector, we often apply that. How much is the whole thing costing, and how many households is it going to support? And we won't, that's not the only metric that we use, but we do always look at that just because it's useful as a kind of very high level rule of thumb. So
Mm.
sorry if that feels like a slightly evasive answer, but I think the thing is that we're trying to take account of the fact there are a lot of different situations, a lot of different technologies, and so we want to kind of treat all of those different situations fairly, which is why we don't just have we expect this amount of carbon per pound spent, because we'd all just probably just put light bulbs in or something like that if that was the case, which
Mm.
there's all sorts of arguments for why that might not be the best outcome.
Okay, great. Yeah, I was just going to flag through the Energy Learning Network, our last webinar was about measuring social impact for community energy projects, and there'll be a bit of reporting guidance coming out hopefully next
Great.
week related to that. And I know Community Energy Pathways have been working on the TOMS social impact framework as well, so hopefully we'll improve on that side of it throughout the year as well.
Yeah. Yeah. All that kind of thing is really useful.
Yeah. So next question, this is from Daniel Beaton. So could you talk about what you're looking for in terms of strategic value and strategic value for whom?
Mm. Oh, that's a good question. That's quite a high level one. I guess at a very basic level, we're conscious that because we can only put a total of 30% across the two funds of the overall budget into carbon emissions reduction and innovation um, to benefit energy consumers, the amount of money that's needed to do those things is absolutely massive. And although we have millions, it's not very many millions to do that. And so what we want to try and do is target the money towards things that can have a much wider impact than the one, maybe the one site that you're doing it on, for example, or whatever. And I think also we're very conscious of the pace of the transition to net zero, and so we haven't tended to fund kind of very basic awareness raising kind of things because we sort of feel like probably the majority of people out there at least have some kind of basic understanding of and view on climate change. So we want to try and focus the money on how do we actually deliver carbon within the timescale of the transition in the UK, which is really the next, well, a lot of it going to be the next decade, really, isn't it? So the next couple of decades. Um, so it is very much we look at what's the direct impact that the project is going to have, and then what is the scale of the potential wider impact, what's going to be done in the project to realize that wider impact. Basically, what's the likelihood of that wider impact actually happening? So, is it reasonable to think, definitely talk about things like the scale of the market and why what you're doing is replicable elsewhere, because sometimes there might be perceived barriers to that being replicable elsewhere. And if you can understand, I guess a lot of these things aren't going to work everywhere. So if you're saying, I don't know, we're doing something that's particularly targeted at this house type, and this is any information you can provide about how many of those house types there are about, or what percentage of the housing stock, or all of that sort of stuff is really useful. Um, I think now if you're talking about the in the feedback section, there is a section that has a heading on strategic value. So, and that might be what the question's about. I just realised after after that monologue, which was hopefully useful anyway. Um, so the strategic value section in the feedback covers, and I'm just going to read out the the sections here. So it covers things like additionality. So is this project clearly something that doesn't duplicate other things that either you're doing or other organizations are doing? It covers the innovation, it covers the replication. So it is the stuff that I've been talking about anyway, but this specific thing is there. So yeah, replication, next steps, and also the risks section. So it's a lot of those things that are about they are more strategic issues, but it's does this add value beyond everything else that's going on? How much impact could it have more widely? Is it replicable and all of that kind of thing? And the risks section is it can be quite important, particularly if you're doing something that's a bit new and a bit different. It's a I I'd be the first to admit doing risk registers is not necessarily the most enjoyable thing in the world, but it can be really useful to your application that if you're doing something that you're conscious is, hasn't been done before, there are some risks with it. It is worth really paying attention to that section because you can offset those like an assessor might have read through the application and start thinking, oh, hang on, what if this happens and what if that happens? Um, and the risks section is a really good opportunity to say, actually, we've thought of that, and these are the things that we're going to do to make sure that that's not an issue. So definitely it's one of those sections it's worth just having a little look at. Some projects might be low risk, and it's just about making sure that you're kind of looking after the participants and all of that sort of stuff. But definitely, if you're doing something that's high cost, potentially has lots of reasons that it might go wrong, the risks section can really help out your application overall. A slightly
Okay,
wide-ranging answer there, John. Sorry about that.
no
Hopefully all
problem.
useful.
Okay, I'll move on to a question now from Giovanna. So this is probably more about a specific type of project that's quite relevant to community energy at the moment, particularly focusing on rooftop solar.
Mm,
Um, so quite a few of the host sites for community rooftop solar have pretty competitive electricity costs. So
mm.
they're forced to offer a fairly low price for the rooftop solar, which doesn't leave a great amount of room to then build up a social community fund off the back of that. Does that count against them as an applicant? And there's a related question as well from Agamemnon. So can the fund be used to give back to communities in other ways? For example, education for young people around energy and environment, or creating access to green space to improve mental health and well-being.
So I guess just to answer the second question first, um, the funds do have to be related to energy, and it has to be related to um, energy, I guess, that is within Ofgem's remit. So, for example, we don't really fund transport projects because it has to be static energy, with one exception, which was actually a community energy sector project. I say one exception, I mean, there can be other exceptions, but if the projects are about, for example, getting community renewables into EV chargers, then that's okay because the project is focused on the energy delivery to the chargers rather than, modal shift or electric vehicles or anything like that. So it does need to be energy focused, and I guess part of the reason we do look at that quite hard because we were starting to get quite a lot of applications, especially kind of soon after COVID, from organizations that kind of do money advice that were sort of saying, can you fund our money advice team because they do some energy advice? And we started to think actually we could end up just spending all the money here and it not really going on energy at all because of the scale of the need for that. So, and Ofgem are quite keen that we stay within their remit. So it does need to be energy. Um, on the question about rooftop solar, um, it's not a showstopper. I guess always probably the key thing to look at in the application is try and be as clear as possible about what is it that the redress money is going to bring about. So uh, we've always said that we could potentially fund community renewables, especially if there's a case to say we were developing this project, it almost works, but then there's this slight, costs are high because it's the first, it's an early stage one or supply chain issues, and we can see that in future this might be doable. I think, and this is probably a good principle with a lot of things. With a lot of projects, we look quite hard at if we're funding this thing, how does it then get to the point that it can just run and happen without subsidy or with a reasonable level of subsidy? Because I guess we get quite a lot of applications that are asking for 100% capital funding, and I guess the thing that we're always a bit concerned about there is there's a very limited pot. We can't 100% capital fund everything. What we really want to do is put some money in to help the business model work in this case, and then it can go off and fly, and then hopefully other people can learn from it and it can spread out. And that's the sort of ideal that we want to fund. So I think the short answer is probably yeah, we could definitely fund things in that area, but I guess it's just be clear about what the redress money is for and what's the extra benefit that the redress money is going to bring, um, and how is that for the public good, if that's helpful.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think, yeah, kind of a follow-on related question to that is, again, from Cara looking at, yeah, we know that the DNOs are kind of quite congested at the moment with applications, and in some regions they're kind of saying the queue is big enough already in terms of the clean power targets. Um, so, is it possible to fund projects that look at solutions to these, like improving grid connections and access to the grid for community energy?
Um, Potentially, yes. Probably things to think about if you're looking in that area. And I guess, we have funded some projects that relate to that in terms of being kind of where we funded a number of sort of energy local club type approaches where they're looking at, at kind of a bit of demand side management and that kind of thing as well. Um, Probably the thing to keep in mind there is, and there's a rule that applies to everything that Redress does, which is that basically anyone that might pay into Redress um, can't benefit from Redress funding. And the intention of that is that if it's, I guess if you had an energy company paying into the fund, it could then end up benefiting from its own fund, or its competitors could end up benefiting from that fund. And I guess we want to try and make sure that the fund is always entirely neutral. Um, so if you're working with network operators, just be aware that they're Ofgem registered companies, and we understand they're a fixture of the energy sector, and you might have to work with them. But I guess when you're writing your application, just make sure that you're really clear that there's not an argument here that the redress fund is reducing their costs, giving them good PR, funding things that they should be funding, or that kind of thing. But we're comfortable with people working alongside network operators, and I think there's definitely some scope for it. Probably also worth just thinking about the other sources of funding that are out there, because we've talked to Ofgem a little bit about this kind of area. And I think they were always keen to make sure that redress is separate from the innovation funds that they already do. So just to flag that. But I think it's a really good area to be looking at generally. Obviously this is all going to be huge for the country as a whole. So yeah, definitely within scope, but just useful to bear those things in mind.
Okay, great. Question here from George Goldberg. So do we need to have defined exactly how we will deliver benefit from the project to vulnerable consumers and how much before bidding, or is it within scope to explore and refine this as part of the project as they get closer to a more precise plan for construction and
Yes, the second one. Yeah, I mean, we're very conscious that Just Transition Fund is funding development work, so projects can change while they're being developed. It wouldn't be helpful for us to try and lock you into something now at this stage that might change later on. Um, but I guess we're do try and give us as much information as you can about how it's going to benefit people in a vulnerable situation, even if it's like, at this stage we're thinking about these things as part of the project. We're going to develop that idea by doing XYZ. All of that kind of stuff is okay. Yeah, we know that things change as projects develop, but I guess we want to try and make sure that we're not exposed to a situation where somebody kind of claims to be doing all of this kind of stuff and then doesn't, which I know is not how this sector works. But obviously, we just need to I guess the better the information you can give us is always helpful. But yeah, we understand those things change. We might have a problem if by the end of the project all the money was going to accrue to a handful of people or something like that. But it's that sort of level of stuff that we're concerned about. I think it's fine if it changes a bit.
okay, great. So we've got a question here about um, how, yeah, can you explain how an organization with no accounts or track record that could justify support for an application should go about partnering with others
Hmm.
to create a successful bid?
Yeah, so this is a good point, and we recognise that this is a challenge for people at the minute. But at the minute, as I mentioned before, when we get people to register, we do some due diligence on people, and that includes financial due diligence. And so we need people's published accounts to do that. If it's a brand new organisation, you won't have published accounts for at least a year, and so it is stopping brand new organisations coming in a lot of the time now. Um, it is an issue that we're thinking about. and in discussion with Ofgem about. Um, I think, but as the question pointed out, you can partner with another organisation as a lead. Um, I think how you go about that, yeah, is a good question. Well, actually, I mean, Community Energy England is potentially a good vehicle for that, and the learning network and those kinds of things. And we're trying to look at how we can work more with Community Energy England, with the DESNZ regional hubs, with other organisations out there to help create more networking opportunities. And we would like to try and do some of that kind of thing ourselves as well, because we understand, yeah, there's times when we see applications that might be for a similar geographical area from organizations with different skills that actually, if they combined, could be much, much better. And you don't have to be a consortium to apply to Redress, I should stress, but we like to see that where it can really bring more value. So yeah, definitely, I mean, probably in the situation you're in, Community Energy England is as good a vehicle as any to go through. But we will be trying to do a little bit more as a program to help put people together if they've got kind of shared interests.
Yeah, I was just going to add on that. Yeah, if you are a Community Energy England member, you can access our Lumio forum to kind of scope out potential applicant ideas and call out for others in the sector who might want to team up with. Likewise, the heat and energy efficiency working groups that Joseph currently coordinates. Yeah, that would be another route to attend those, and yeah, um,
And
good chance to
and
catch up.
if I can just add a extra, I know we're a little bit getting a little bit short time, but just to add to that, because there might be other questions about it, but community energy organizations can be a partner, but not the lead on the main fund and the small grants fund. So we have funded a number of projects where it's led by a charity, but there's a wider consortium that involves community energy groups within that. So you can go that way. And the other benefit of those partnerships is that, sometimes we get applications from organizations that have really good reach to groups that we can see need to be reached, but maybe they haven't really been involved with energy so far. So actually, it doesn't, there's not a strong case to say this is going to be a energy advice approach that works really well. So, we are always really keen to see organizations that have reach, capacity, but maybe are a bit new to some of this stuff, partnering with organizations that are a little bit more experienced to help, deliver a really good outcome in the end. Another thing that's probably worth noting is that we really look quite hard at the outcome for the end user. So that's very much where Ofgem are coming from with this. Is they want um, energy redress funding to benefit people in vulnerable situations and energy consumers generally as much as possible. So definitely always kind of emphasize that side of your applications.
I agree. Just scanning down the list of the questions, see if I can find some quick ones to squeeze in. I presume we might have the chance to kind of follow others up by email. So a quick one from Daniel Beaton. Are cost savings to a community site, for example, solar PV on a primary school in a deprived area, considered to benefit a vulnerable community? Like I guess the counterfact is that a primary school in a well-off area. So would
Yeah, I think generally we don't fund measures that are kind of just on one public building, because we would very quickly spend all of the budget on solar panels on village halls potentially, because there's just a lot of demand for that out there, and we want to try and focus the money where it can have more impact. And theoretically, we can. I think Ofgem want to keep the money quite focused on energy consumers, and obviously, organisations are energy consumers as well. Um, But I guess the thing to bear in mind is it's potentially up against projects that are supporting people in desperate situations in fuel poverty, and so that can be tricky. But that's not, it's not to say it's impossible. Or if you were working with a school in a deprived area and also kind of getting energy advice out to um, uh, via the pupils to the parents and that kind of thing, then then that can work out. But we've generally steered away from kind of single installations in single buildings, partly because also PV is getting to the point where it's starting to be a good investment anyway. So definitely, if you were thinking about doing that stuff, I guess have that in mind. And Redress can fund the extra bit that makes it not doable, but it might not necessarily fund 100% if there's an argument to say actually it's going to pay for itself in a few years anyway, if that makes sense.
So I think I'll just one couple more very quick processing questions. If we have more than one project, can we put them all in one application or should we make multiple applications? And can you advise on whether it's a best fit for the Innovation Fund or the Just Transition Fund?
So for the first bit, and do remind me of the second bit
Yeah,
if I forget that. But for the first bit, a really useful question to ask. So we have a rule that you can only one that an organization can only lead one project per round. So you can't kind of put two projects under different funds in the same round. But you could apply in this round and then next round. I guess the other side of that is I would only put two projects together if they fit together in a kind of sensible and rational way, because sometimes we get applications from organizations that are actually doing really interesting and diverse stuff, but sometimes so much of that stuff is included in the bid that it sort of makes it a bit difficult to tease out which is the bit that redress is funding and what's the impact that the redress bit's going to have. So if you are doing a project that's kind of multifaceted, or if you're asking redress for a particular thing, but you're doing loads of stuff around it, I would encourage you always to really focus on, is it absolutely clear what we need the redress money for and what impact that redress money is going to have? And by all means, include a bit of information about the rest, but not so much, I guess. And if you've got two things that fit together in a really rational way, by all means put them in one application. But I guess if they're two completely different things, it might be better to do them in two applications.
great. Thanks, Graham. I think we're
Um,
coming up close to the
there
hour.
was there was a second part to the question, wasn't there?
Oh, is
Which I
it, can
have
you,
predictably forgotten.
if they think there's a crossover between two fund themes, can you
Oh,
advise
yes.
on the best one to go for?
Um, we don't always, I guess we're a bit shy of advising people on it because we kind of think you know your project better than we do. But the other thing that I would say is particularly with innovation and just transition fund, sorry, innovation and carbon emissions fund generally, if you think your project actually meets the needs of both of those, put it in for whichever one you think is closest. But you can by all means make the point and say, look, we think this is an innovative project that also delivers carbon emissions funds, so we'd be happy for it to be considered under either, because we are allowed to be a little bit pragmatic, and we don't want a situation where we're refusing a project because all of the innovation money's spent, but the other fund is underspent. Basically, if one fund is underspent and there's, as long as the project delivers against the priorities of the fund it ends up being funded, we can move stuff backwards and forwards a little bit. We're allowed to do that. And so and by all means tell us that if you think your project meets the needs of two different funds. But I guess Just Transition Fund is quite specific. It's development work towards a renewables project. So if it's a bit broader than that, probably go under another fund.
Excellent. Right. Yeah, thanks for that, Graham. I think we're wrapping up now. I think Joseph's got a little poll just for you to complete as part of this. Where's my notes gone? So, yeah, I think, yeah, thanks for taking the time to do that today, Graham. Good luck to everyone who's going to be submitting applications. The recording will be available on our YouTube channel. Just a few quick things to mention whilst you're all still here. So it is currently the open time for our State of the Sector survey. The data we collect from you all is really important to kind of showcase back to DESNZ and others about the success of what we're all collectively doing. So yeah, please follow the links through to our State of the Sector portal and register via sots@communityenergyengland.org to complete that. If your projects aren't on our national map, that's another very good way to make things visible. It's the most visited bit of our website, 110,000 views, and yeah, about 5,000 views per month. Really good way of showcasing all the activity we're doing. And yes, reminders, we've got our conferences coming up So check out our events page, be updating that soon. And as a membership organisation, if you're not a member, do consider joining us. And then I think we've got renewals out at the moment as well. So yeah, the more organisations we represent, the stronger our voice is, the more learning we can share, and the more connections we can facilitate across our network. So thank you everyone for attending today's session and for all your contributions.